The stage burned under white-hot spotlights, every polished surface of the set gleaming for the cameras. The audience was primed, laughter already spilling too easily, like steam rising from a pot. Steve Harvey was in his element, strutting between the cue marks, suit sharp, smile wide, voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. He knew how to play a crowd. Years of stand-up had taught him when to stretch a pause, when to jab with a punchline, and when to let silence hang for just long enough to sharpen the release. The early jokes landed as expected. Digs at Hollywood egos, jabs about actors' botched sequels, a well-worn line about celebrity marriages. The crowd laughed dutifully, leaning into the warmth of the performance. The cameras swept across faces, capturing stars in gowns and tuxedos, teeth shining as they threw their heads back. Everything moved as it always did, predictable and safe. Then Harvey paused, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He adjusted his tie, leaned into the microphone, and said it. "I don't need training to beat Chuck Norris." The man's been a punchline longer than he's been a fighter. It hit like a slap across the room. At first came the reflexive laughter, the crowd trained to respond. A pocket of people in the front row clapped hard, eager to signal they understood the joke. But the laughter wasn't unanimous. From the back of the theater came a murmur, low and uneasy. Somewhere in the dark, a man's voice rang out clear enough to cut through the noise. "Hey, that's too far." The cameras caught the shift instantly. Wide shots showed rows of faces caught mid-expression, some smiling too broadly, others frozen, unsure whether to laugh or grimace. A woman in a sequined dress covered her mouth, not in shock, but in discomfort. A producer watching from the wings felt the air change, like a room where the thermostat had suddenly been cut. The laughter that had begun so strongly now splintered. It was nervous, jagged, breaking into awkward patches instead of rolling like a wave. Harvey smirked, waiting for the crowd to reassemble under his control. For a moment, he looked confident, but behind the grin was a flicker of something else, an awareness that he might have stepped somewhere he couldn't easily joke his way out of. Because this wasn't just another name tossed into a punchline. This was Chuck Norris. Everyone in that hall knew the weight of those words. They knew they would echo outside the theater, into living rooms, into social feeds, into headlines. It wasn't a private joke told among friends. It was a broadcast challenge, an insult delivered under spotlights to millions. Some in the audience laughed louder, trying to drown out the unease. Others folded their arms, frowning. A man in the third row muttered to his wife, "Why go after him?" The cameras swept again, catching celebrities caught in the middle, half smiling, half grimacing, their eyes betraying the awkwardness they couldn't hide. Harvey leaned into the crowd, raising his eyebrows as if daring them to disagree. "Come on," he added, spreading his hands wide. "You know I'm right." The words didn't land like he expected. The silence between laughs stretched longer than usual. A cough echoed. The spotlight seemed harsher, brighter, exposing more than it illuminated. For the first time that night, Harvey wasn't steering the room. He was clinging to it. What no one could say out loud, at least not yet, was that the insult had crossed a line. It wasn't clever banter. It wasn't affectionate ribbing. It was a dismissal of a man whose name still carried weight, far beyond cinema. A man who symbolized something larger than scripts or fight choreography. And somewhere deep in the hall, beneath the nervous laughter and half-hearted applause, people felt it. These words would not end here. They would reach Chuck Norris. And when they did, silence would no longer be an option. The show rolled on, but the fracture had already formed. Just wondering. Where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The insult hadn't finished echoing before it was clipped, subtitled, and fired into every corner of the internet. By morning, headlines framed it as if it were news, not comedy. Harvey mocks Norris on live TV. Comment sections swelled with strangers piling on, memes sprouting like weeds. Inside the studio, staff whispered that something unusual was planned for the next taping. No names, no confirmations, just an edge in the air. A black sedan was spotted idling at the stage door. Crew members straightened their headsets, their movements clipped, as though bracing for a storm. The studio smelled of floor polish and hairspray. Warm lights pressed down, flattening every color. The audience filed into their folding seats, laughing too loudly at the warm-up comic, clutching bottled water as if it might anchor them when the real show began. Steve Harvey paced backstage, cue cards in hand. He told himself he'd done this 1,000 times. His grin was set, his tie crisp. But the cards felt heavier tonight, the jokes brittle in his fingers. When the band struck its opening sting, he strode out under the lights. The first lines landed easily enough, safe material about traffic and celebrity egos. The crowd laughed on cue. For a heartbeat, it felt normal. Then the room changed. A camera broke from its mark, sliding toward the aisle. Audience heads turned as one. The monitors caught it too. Chuck Norris was walking down the center aisle. No announcement, no music. Just steady steps, unhurried, as if time itself had to wait for him. He wore a dark jacket and white shirt, nothing flashy. His pace was deliberate, every movement measured. He sat in the front row, the empty seat reserved as if everyone had feared and hoped he might fill it. The atmosphere collapsed into silence. Laughter died in mid-breath. A woman lowered her phone without realizing it. Somewhere in the balcony, a cough cracked the air like a gavel. Even the band, sensing something had shifted, dropped their instruments into uneasy quiet. Steve looked down and saw him. His smile froze, teeth still showing, but the warmth gone. He tugged at his jacket hem, trying to keep the performance rolling. "Well," he said, aiming for breezy and hitting brittle, "look who decided to show up." A handful of people laughed, more out of obligation than amusement. The rest just watched. The silence stretched, filling every corner. The director cut to a close-up. Chuck's face filled the giant screens. Beard neat, jaw firm, eyes steady. No anger, just a quiet, level appraisal. It was the absence of reaction that made it brutal. Steve reached for his safer lines, words about the weather, about awards shows dragging too long. But each landed weak, laughs thinning until they disappeared altogether. The air felt like a classroom after the principal walks in. Nobody moving. Nobody willing to be the fool. Chuck sat motionless, hands resting calmly, shoulders square. Not a twitch, not a glance at the cameras. He didn't need to raise his voice. His stillness was louder than anything Harvey could say. The crowd became a character of its own. In the middle rows, a teenager dropped the foam finger she'd brought for the taping. Up top, two friends leaned toward each other. One whispered, "Can you feel that?" The other just nodded. In the front, a man crossed his arms and stared hard at the stage. Steve kept talking, words tumbling out, but the audience was no longer with him. Their eyes drifted, pulled to the front row, to the figure who hadn't spoken a word. The cameras kept cutting back to Chuck. The close-ups revealed the smallest details. The controlled inhale through his nose, the knuckles loose on the armrests, the faint tilt of the head as if measuring the weight of the moment. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just control. A producer scribbled a note and had it passed down. The slip reached Steve. Acknowledge him. Move on. He glanced at the words, then at the front row. He tried again, forcing a smile. Since you're here. The phrase broke apart in his mouth. He laughed at his own stumble, but the hollowness echoed. Chuck didn't move, didn't blink. Someone in the audience began clapping, a single pair of hands striking in the quiet. Others joined, unsure at first, then stronger, the sound swelling. Not laughter, not relief. Applause, for presence. Steve grabbed at it like a lifeline, waving as though he'd meant for this all along. But the energy was gone from his voice. The show was no longer his. As the segment rolled toward commercial, the band tried to play them out. But the truth had already settled in. Chuck had taken the stage without stepping onto it. He had stripped Harvey of the one thing he lived on, control of the room. And everyone in that studio knew, this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something they could no longer stage manage. During the break, producers moved fast. Headsets crackled, hands flew, cue cards reshuffled. What no one had dared suggest out loud now became a segment, a friendly demonstration. A stagehand laid 2 strips of gaffer tape on the floor. The warm-up comic tried to kill the tension, but the audience only fidgeted, their eyes on the empty marks. When the show came back live, Steve Harvey smiled too wide. "Since our guest is here," he said, the word guest hanging in the air like an apology, "we thought we'd clear something up. I may have said I don't need training to beat him, so let's show the people." Nice and easy. Laughter was thin, uncertain. All eyes turned to the front row. Chuck stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, then unbuttoned it again. Practical, not showy. He walked onto the stage with no wasted motion, each step deliberate. At his mark, he planted his feet, posture calm, controlled. The cameras zoomed close, his jaw set, his hands loose at his sides. No aggression, no nerves, just presence. Harvey stepped to his tape line, trying to stay loose. "Okay, nothing serious," he said, raising his hands in a mock guard. He threw a jokey jab. Chuck didn't flinch. The fist swiped through empty air, landing nowhere. The audience gave a ripple of laughter, edged with relief. The host exaggerated his movements, chopping the air, kicking high, yelling, "Hiya!" like a cartoon. The band gave a rim shot, but it fell flat. Sweat gathered at his temple. He stepped in closer for effect, reaching for Chuck's shoulder. A flicker of motion, barely visible. Chuck's forearm brushed the inside of the wrist, turned it, and folded Harvey's elbow neatly back toward his chest. No pain, no violence, just geometry. The crowd gasped. Chuck released immediately. "Whoa!" Harvey forced a grin, circling. "Old dog's got a trick." He winked at the camera, but the joke slid past. He tried again, a playful shoulder bump. Chuck shifted his weight, rotated a few degrees, and the bump missed. An open hand guided Harvey's arm aside. He stumbled 3 steps backward to keep balance. This time the audience erupted, not with laughter, but applause. The energy shifted. People stood in pockets, shouting, clapping. Someone whistled sharply. On the big screens, the contrast was obvious. Harvey loud, clumsy, sweating. Chuck quiet, exact, untouched. Harvey tried to reclaim control. "All right, one more, just to prove I'm not scared." He reached for Chuck's collar, but before he touched, Chuck lifted one palm, inches from contact. The suggestion alone stopped him cold. For a moment, Harvey stood suspended, his own hand frozen in space, the room holding its breath. Chuck lowered his arm and stepped back, letting the silence speak. The crowd rose to its feet. Applause crashed down like a wave. It wasn't for comedy. It was for control. The cameras closed on Harvey, jaw tight, smile stiff. Then on Chuck. Eyes steady, body relaxed, the faintest tilt of the head like a teacher releasing a student back to class. The ovation didn't stop. A man near the stage shouted, "Respect!" The word caught, echoed in the upper rows. The band tried to play, but Chuck lifted his hand slightly, and the drummer froze, silenced by a gesture. The audience roared even louder, laughter this time directed at Harvey's loss of command. The host nodded, still smiling, but everyone could see the sweat shining now, the stiffness in his shoulders. He lowered his arms slowly, like someone setting down a burden. 2 strips of tape separated them under the lights, glowing like a boundary that no joke could cross. The audience quieted on its own, breath held. Harvey's throat worked. He wanted the next line to land like a joke, but it came out like a dare. "All right," he said, voice steady but thin. "What if we try it? Not so friendly." The hush that followed was absolute. Cameras tightened on the 2 faces, one sweating, one unreadable. Chuck dropped his eyes for a second, as though measuring the floor itself, then looked back up. And in that look, the crowd felt it. The real fight hadn't begun yet. They called it a sparring demonstration, but everyone in the building felt the quotation marks. No gloves, no headgear, no bell. Just 2 marks of tape in the center of the stage and a room leaning forward hard enough to move the air. The floor manager made the safety speech into a microphone that wasn't quite loud enough. His words dissolved before they reached the upper rows. This wasn't about choreography. It was about character. Steve Harvey stepped onto his strip of tape with an extra bounce that didn't belong to his legs. He took the mic in one hand like a prop and let the other hand describe broad, confident circles. "I told y'all," he said, grinning too wide, "this man's just a myth." The grin wobbled, the vowels flattened. His voice reached for swagger and found tremor. On the other strip, Chuck Norris set his feet and let his hands hang, palms half open, as if ready to either catch a falling glass or refuse a handshake. He didn't speak. He didn't wink at the cameras. He settled into a posture older than the lights and let the room measure itself against his stillness. The crowd split down the middle, gasps and laughter, awe and skepticism, 2 weather systems colliding under the same roof. A woman in the 3rd row clasped her hands, eyes bright. 2 college kids up top elbowed each other and whispered bets. A veteran in dress blues near the aisle didn't move at all. The atmosphere felt less like a show, more like a hearing. "Friendly," Steve reminded everyone, though it sounded like a plea. He raised his hands in a loose parody of a guard, elbows flared, television boxing, not fighting. Then, with a flourish meant to read as playful, he shot a looping cartoon punch, the kind of motion that belongs to a pratfall. Chuck's answer happened inside the space of a blink. His lead shoulder rolled a thumb's width. His forearm floated up and met Steve's wrist exactly where speed turned into slack. No smack, no slap, just a redirect that melted the line of force. Chuck's other hand landed soft on Steve's shoulder, a placement more than a push. Gravity did the rest. Steve's heels skidded. His balance went hunting for a floor that had moved. The room detonated, not with laughter. The show had wrung that rag dry, but with a raw sound that lives between surprise and approval. Some people shouted. Others simply stood, palms meeting hard and fast, like they were applauding a truth that had finally made itself visible. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like a correction. Steve caught himself, spun it into a smile, and turned to the audience with hands high, the universal sign for, "I meant to do that." "That was nothing," he barked, crisp with embarrassment. "Anybody can trip." The mic picked up the scrape of his shoe as if to argue. He tossed the mic aside to free both hands. Let's go again. He rushed. He had to. Rushing is how you drown out doubt. Chuck didn't move much. That was the lesson. He slid half a foot, rotated a few degrees, and let Steve's momentum do the arithmetic. When Steve reached to collar tie for control, Chuck's palm guided the forearm down and across, turning the reaching arm into a lever against its owner's balance. Steve's knees found the stage sooner than his brain did. He wasn't down, just low enough to feel the air different. He jerked upright with a red flush climbing his neck, the kind of color that makes a crowd smell blood. Cameras found faces like birds find thermals. A kid with his mouth open, a woman laughing without sound, a man mouthing wow like a prayer. The veterans didn't cheer. They nodded, chin-length movements that said they recognized the economy of it. Steve's voice pitched up a half step. "This isn't fair," he snapped, sweeping an arm in a wide, theatrical arc that looked brave and felt frantic. "Y'all worship him like a god." The sentence scattered against the noise. The crowd had stopped listening to what he said and started listening to how he sounded. Pride was talking, not skill. He lunged again, harder, sloppier. The body betrays the mind when it thinks it's losing. Chuck's reply was almost nothing. A shift of hips, a hand that met an elbow and gave it 1 inch of suggestion, a step that arrived before it looked like a step. Steve's grip failed without being broken. He stumbled through the space where Chuck had been. The audience cried out in a single involuntary "oh" that bent upward at the end, astonished. "Keep it light," the floor manager hissed into a headset. No one heard. The band leader, panicking, dropped a jaunty hi-hat pattern that clashed with the moment. Chuck glanced once toward the drummer. Not a glare, just a look that asked for quiet. The sticks stopped midair. The crowd laughed, quick, grateful, then returned to the lesson. Steve wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, cheeks shining under the lamps. He squared to the tape line like a man demanding that the ground honor a contract. He feinted big, then bigger, and when even that didn't move Chuck, he drove straight, chest first, arms reaching for anything to make the stage his again. Chuck let him arrive. Then he removed the argument. A palm-kissed tricep, soft, exact, while his center turned and his base stayed where force lives. Momentum unhooked from intent. Steve wasn't thrown. He was placed into the idea of falling and given the option not to. He took it, wobbling back into a stand that looked like surrender dressed as pride. The temperature spiked. People weren't asking for blood anymore. They were asking for mercy they could respect. A chant started in the right balcony. Respect, respect. Awkward at first, then rhythmic enough to feel like a drum. Security looked at the aisle and stayed put. Steve's chest heaved. He rolled his shoulders to hide it, and failed. "You done?" he panted at Chuck, trying to wrestle contempt back into his voice. It came out small. Chuck's expression didn't change. He angled his chin a degree, neither yes nor no, the kind of answer that returns the question to the one who asked it. He still hadn't said a word. The audience had, in their thousands. With the way they chose their breath and how they spent their hands, Steve planted his feet as if nails would help. One last try, or he wouldn't sleep. He stepped in with a straight, earnest push. No comedy now, just the simple human need to make contact that means control. Chuck listened with his hands. He received the push and gave it a place to go that wasn't Steve's. The motion collapsed in on itself like a wave meeting a breakwater. The noise that followed wasn't a roar. It was a verdict. Up in the booth, a producer counted down to commercial and forgot to say now. The red tally lights on 3 cameras held steady, as if the hardware understood better than the humans that you don't cut away from a moment becoming itself. Down on the tape, two men stood inside a boundary drawn by gaffer and television and found out what it didn't contain. Steve had the mic, the lights, the reflexes of a lifetime in rooms like this. Chuck had the discipline to put nothing extra on anything. The difference had just become visible to anyone with eyes. It still wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. And lessons, when they land, don't ask permission from the person being taught. Steve backed off half a step and looked to the audience for rescue. They didn't move. They were waiting to see whether he could find a way to step down without stepping off. He couldn't. Not yet. Pride never goes quietly. He jabbed a finger at the floor, trying to summon the show back. "One more," he barked, a coach to a team already beaten. The room did not cheer, it inhaled. Across from him, Chuck shifted just enough to remind everyone he was still there. The space between them tightened, thin as wire, and for the first time all night, Steve seemed to hear the quiet. He blinked, swallowed, and found himself standing in front of a question bigger than the joke that brought him there. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were leaning. Every seat had tilted toward the stage, shoulders forward, necks extended, waiting to see whether pride would take Steve Harvey all the way into self-destruction. The cameras swept wide, and the monitors showed an ocean of faces, some grinning nervously, some stone serious, all caught between spectacle and reckoning. Steve's chest heaved under his suit jacket. His bow tie looked tighter than it had 10 minutes ago. He jabbed a finger toward the floor, his voice breaking as it climbed. "That was nothing! Anybody can trip!" His words came out sharp, brittle, and ricocheted off the walls like glass about to shatter. The audience didn't laugh. The sound they gave back was rougher, a mix of boos, applause, and a low murmur that belonged more to a courtroom than a theater. Chuck Norris hadn't moved. He stood inside his strip of tape, eyes calm, body rooted, every inch of him refusing the performance. The cameras zoomed in, catching the contrast. Steve red-faced, sweating, his gestures too wide, while Chuck's stillness seemed to press the air tighter around him. Then Steve lunged again, not as a joke, not as parody. He charged forward with both hands, like a man trying to shove down the tide. The move carried weight, but no direction. Chuck's reaction was almost invisible. A sidestep, a turn of the hips, a hand rising just enough to meet the incoming force. In a breath, Steve's momentum folded him down, his knees touching the stage as if the floor had always been waiting. The sound from the audience hit like thunder. Children's eyes went wide, their mouths open in disbelief. A woman clapped a hand to her lips, torn between shock and delight. Veterans in the crowd sat straighter, nodding slowly, the way men nod when they see discipline in action. The monitors caught everything: shock, awe, and the slow turning of loyalty. Steve scrambled back up, cheeks glowing crimson, his voice cracking high. "This isn't fair," he shouted, his words laced with panic. "You all worship him like a god." His protest hung in the air, brittle as paper, and was immediately drowned by the roar. The chant started small. 2 voices in the back, then 4, then a wave rolling across the balcony. "Norris! Norris! Exclamation mark. Hands slammed together, feet stamped. The name beat like a drum. It wasn't just applause now. It was judgment, delivered by thousands. Steve spun in place, eyes darting from section to section, searching for a lifeline in the crowd. He found none. Every corner of the theater had turned against him. What was supposed to be comedy, light entertainment, had become trial by fire, and the verdict was already forming. Desperation twisted his face. "You want a show?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Fine! Watch this!" He rushed forward, swinging in a wide arc meant to look powerful, but landing slow, sloppy, reckless. Chuck didn't answer with force. He lifted one arm, placed a hand lightly against Steve's elbow, and turned. The redirection was so gentle it seemed impossible. Steve spun himself halfway around, stumbling forward a step before catching balance. The image was humiliating. One man sweating, straining, shouting, the other guiding with gestures barely bigger than a breath. Gasps, then cheers. The camera panned across the audience, a boy pumping his fists in the air, a woman with tears streaming down her cheeks, two Marines in uniform nodding in perfect unison. The energy surged into something beyond entertainment. This was not about one man's ego anymore. It was about who still carried the dignity of control. Steve froze, trembling hands clenching and unclenching. His suit clung with sweat. He opened his mouth to shout again, but the sound wouldn't come. He was choking on the moment, and the crowd knew it. They howled, some in pity, more in triumph, voices crashing together until the rafters shook. For the first time all night, the cameras caught Chuck moving with intent. He raised one hand, not in defense, not in attack, but in quiet command. The gesture alone was enough to hush the room by degrees, applause fading to murmurs, murmurs dropping into silence. Steve looked around at the sudden quiet, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. The silence cut sharper than any boo. It left him standing under the lights, exposed, a man out of breath against someone who hadn't broken a sweat. The question settled into the air. Would he break himself, trying again? Or would someone finally stop him? And as Steve's fists tightened, the audience leaned forward once more, waiting to see whether the next second would destroy him completely, or whether Chuck would show him mercy. The theater felt like it had stopped breathing. Steve's fists hovered, shoulders rigid, but his eyes betrayed him. He looked less like a fighter, and more like a man cornered by his own words. The crowd leaned forward as one, waiting to see if pride would push him too far. Then Chuck raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic, just a calm palm placed between the room and its own chaos. The effect was instant. Applause stuttered, then fell silent. Within seconds, the theater sank into a stillness so deep, the hum of the air conditioning and the faint creak of cameras were suddenly audible. Steve froze, caught in the gravity of that small gesture. His shoe slid half an inch, as if the floor had tilted. Chuck stepped slightly aside, clearing space rather than taking it. When he spoke, the words carried without strain. Strength isn't mocking. It's respect. Tonight, you mocked, and it broke you, not me. The line landed like stone in water. In the front rows, people blinked. Further back, heads nodded. Two Marines didn't clap. They just sat straighter, holding the silence. Steve opened his mouth, but nothing came. The cameras caught the sweat glistening, the tremor in his jaw. His chest rose and fell fast, pride collapsing under its own weight. Chuck lowered his hand. He gave the crowd a small nod, almost imperceptible. That was enough. Applause erupted, first scattered, then a wave. People rose to their feet, shouting his name. The chant swelled. Norris! Norris! Exclamation mark. The band leader lifted his sticks, then stopped. The crowd didn't need music. The cameras swept the theater. A child clapping on her father's shoulders, a woman crying openly, a veteran pounding his palms in cadence. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a verdict. Steve stood in the middle, crushed by the spotlight that had once served him. The grin was gone. His shoulders slumped. He picked up the microphone but didn't raise it. The silence that greeted him wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was indifference. Chuck gave the audience one last gift, a faint smile. Then he turned and walked off stage. No bow, no wave. just a steady stride down the aisle. The crowd parted instinctively. A guard at the exit straightened as if saluting. Chuck passed without breaking pace. On stage, Steve remained. He tried to speak, but nothing came. He nodded once, small, broken, and lowered his eyes. The show stumbled forward because it had to. Music rose. Teleprompters scrolled. Steve read the next introduction with the voice of a man filling time, not leading it. The audience clapped politely, but the echo of the ovation still hung heavier than the script. Outside, people spilled into the Los Angeles night with the stunned energy of witnesses. Conversation sparked. It wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. He stopped the room with just his hand. A teenage girl texted her father. "You were right about him." Inside the control room, the director replayed the clip. Chuck's hand rising, the silence, the line about respect. By morning it would loop endlessly online. But no screen could capture the weight in the air, the way thousands felt corrected at once. The final shot stayed on Steve, alone. The circle of light narrowed, leaving him stranded with nothing but the echo. His show wasn't ruined. Something heavier had occurred. The room had decided who held the truth. And as the credits rolled, the question wasn't whether Chuck Norris could still fight. It was whether anyone else could stand under that light and choose silence as power when pride demanded noise.